meeting here today, and we're looking forward to, we're having a hearing on some methane products and stuff. So, but we wanted to mention today the young stockman folks from the Kansas Livestock Association are here at the Capitol Day, and they're in our committee, and I want you to go around and introduce yourselves and tell us where you're from, and you can tell who your state senator is if you know.
Jack Adams from Plains, Kansas, and Senator Ron Wyden.
Is that everybody? Well, good. Thank you very much. You had a good turnout, and we appreciate that very much, and we're glad you're here today. And what we're going to be doing today is having a hearing on Senate Bill 71, and it's got deals with methane gas and production of that by individuals. And so with that, we will call the meeting to order, and we will begin with on Senate Bill 71, the proponents, Robert Cassad, Blue, Flame.
Can I explain the bill first?
Oh, okay, that's right. Sorry, I was ahead of myself. We need to let the reviser start first. That's my fault. I need to let the reviser explain the.
That's fine.
Sorry about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, committee. I'll try to be brief so you can get to the real star of the show. Senate Bill 71 would require the Secretary of Agriculture to establish a division of sustainable agriculture on or before June 1st of this year for the purpose of allocating grants, loans, bond guarantees, and other financial and technical assistance to sustainable agriculture districts using federal grant money from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The funds distributed to sustainable agriculture districts would be used for the construction and commissioning of renewable natural gas plants or sustainable ammonia or urea plants. Additionally, the Secretary would be required to establish a nonprofit organization called the Kansas Sustainable Agricultural Fund that qualifies as an eligible recipient to obtain federal grants to provide capital and other financial assistance to sustainable agricultural districts for renewable natural gas plants or sustainable ammonia or urea plants. Sustainable agriculture districts are defined in the bill as improvement districts incorporated under KSA 19-2753 to provide means whereby producers of agricultural commodities can reap economic benefits from renewable energy and sustainable agricultural practices. The bill would take effect upon publication in the Kansas Register, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Committee, any questions for the reviser? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. When it's bond guarantees kind of caught my eye. Is there any kind of limits to those kind of things as far as guarantees? You know anything?
The bill doesn't speak to it, so I can't answer your question.
Okay. I just would be interested if there's any kind of limits to it.
I can
I
look
know
into
what
that
we're
for
getting
you.
obligated to here.
I'll look into it for you.
All right, thank you.
Any others, questions? Seeing none, thank you, Tamara. I did want to mention to the committee that myself and Senator Reichman have pages coming for the pictures of the governor's office, so we'll have to be leaving right at 9 o'clock, and we'll have the capable hands of Senator Fagg will take over when we're done so. He's really good at it, so. Anyway, so first up then is Robert Hassad. Welcome to the committee, and we're glad you're here.
Thank you for hearing me. I did submit an extensive written statement. I encourage you to read that. I'm not going to just read that here. I'm going to try and explain the central issues. I am a scientist and a patent lawyer who worked for 17 of the past 18 years in Denmark in the biofuels industry. Now, in Denmark, renewable natural gas, biomethane technology is highly evolved and developed. 30% of the gas grid in Denmark is now renewable natural gas, and they're on track to be 100% by 2030 because of all the trouble with Russia and so on. While in Denmark, I conceived of a plan whereby renewable natural gas plants can become the primary driver of economic development in rural Kansas communities. And I returned to my native Kansas to actualize that plan. And this bill is about asking the state to help me actualize that plan. So let me explain a little bit about what the plan exactly is. First and foremost, you need to understand that in the USA, under the Renewable Fuel Standards, which was passed by the Energy Policy Act of 2005, there's very substantial revenues to be made from renewable natural gas to the extent that it is used for use in transport. The EPA issues what's called a renewable identification number for biomethane that has been used in transport. And these so-called RINs, the petroleum refiners are obliged to buy them. There's a market for the RINs. The law specifies a target of 16 billion gallon equivalents per year, whereas the supply as of this time is 510 million. So between 510 million and 16 billion gallons gasoline equivalent per year, there's a lot of room for growth in this area. That corresponds to 2,810 plants of the size that I'm building in Kingman right now, basically one for every agricultural county in the country. Anyway, so let me explain about use in transport. As that term is interpreted by the EPA, that reaches off-road engines, most notably including irrigation pumps. So irrigation pumps in Kansas, of which there are 23,000, about 60-some% of them run on natural gas. They have a pipeline tap, and they run their irrigation pump on natural gas. If we had the irrigation pumps in Kansas running on renewable natural gas, that would provide revenues, RINs, that would support 43 plants of the size that I'm trying to build in Kingman. The central issue here is that agricultural commodities are what's used to make biomethane. Now, a private company isn't going to build one of these plants because the agricultural commodities cost money. They build these plants running on dairy manure or municipal waste, which is free or which people even pay them to get rid of. On the other hand, if a public entity whose purpose was to support economic development in rural areas was owning the plant, it would create jobs, it would create a market for the agricultural commodities, and it would also create renewable fuel that could be used, for example, in dual fuel pickups. Every new model pickup in the U.S. right now has a factory kit for a dual fuel conversion where you can run on either compressed natural gas or diesel or gasoline. So this is a quite real prospect. Kansas law, with its home rule principles, provides a mechanism whereby this can be accomplished. Under Kansas law, landowners, i.e. farmers, can petition county government to have their land included in what's called an improvement district. This is a public corporation with elected directors that is a political subdivision of county government. It has the lawful authority under the law to issue tax-free revenue bonds to finance such a plant. So the whole concept here, which I dreamed up in Denmark, is that we can get green investors from all over the country to buy tax-free Kansas sustainable agriculture bonds to build biomethane plants in rural Kansas communities with their end user being irrigation pumps, and support something like 43 such projects in Kansas. Each one of these plants would have something like 8 employees and 3 or 4 drivers, and you'd create a market for example, cover crops, Sudan grass planted as a cover crop. So the improvement district mechanism provides a legal way that we can do this as publicly. These are public bodies that own these plants, and we can attract investment from all over the country to pull this off. I came back to the U.S. to do this. I'm a 6th-generation Kansan, and so I'm not sorry that I came back. I've been living for the last year in Kingman, and I've been working on the ground in Kingman, and we got a lot of support from the county government. Kingman is home to one of only 3 CNG fueling stations, compressed natural gas fueling stations, in all of Kansas west of Wichita. So there's already a sort of kernel of people who are running dual fuel pickups and who are, of course, enthusiastic about what I'm trying to do. We had a petition from 41 landowners, and the county government held hearings and officially established Kansas Sustainable Agriculture District number 001 in Kingman. And we are in the process now of trying to organize a bond to finance a plant run on grass silage, Sudan grass, planted as a cover crop, and feedlot manure. We're in the process of trying to organize this right now. We applied to the USDA for a grant to help us do this. I don't know if we'll get the grant, but the point is that grant application, which I've included for you to look at, it explains the nuts and bolts of how all this works. So another thing, very, very important thing that I only discovered on the ground in Kingman, can we see Appendix B now? I didn't dream this up in Denmark. I discovered this here in Kansas, living in Kingman. This is a map that shows you the distribution in Kansas of Class 2 underground injection wells. These are very, very important to the rest of the story here. These wells are under the jurisdiction of the Kansas Corporation Commission. The EPA has nothing to say of it. It's completely within Kansas that the legalities of these wells are controlled. 7,000 of those 11,000 black dots are known as, are called enhanced oil recovery wells. And what an enhanced oil recovery well is, they take the production brine. When you pull oil and gas out of the ground, it's mixed with salt water. And when you put that salt water back into the ground, it's put back under pressure in order to help drive out more oil out of the field. 7,000 enhanced oil recovery wells in Kansas. And in every one of those wells, we can dispose of CO2. So a biomethane plant produces biogas, which is a mixture of CO2 and methane. You clean up the methane and put that in the pipeline, and then you have a stream of pure CO2, or comparatively pure CO2, that we can compress and put into one of those 7,000 enhanced oil recovery wells. This is worth a lot of money, $60 a ton, that the federal government now will pay. B, it makes our story very attractive to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. $26.7 billion has been allocated to be spent before the next election in 2024 in grants to states and eligible entities for projects that support greenhouse gas reduction. Kansas is the best state in the country for doing this. This is small-scale CO2 sequestration. Most of the CO2 sequestration that you see is millions of tons per year injected into the ground with these huge, expensive systems. We would have a very modest 20,000 tons a year from one of our biomethane plants. But there's only 2 other states in the country that have this possibility, Texas and Oklahoma. And neither Texas nor Oklahoma has the possibility of the Rural Improvement District mechanism to attract outside money to finance all of this. So I want to drive home with everybody how really significant this is. Kansas is the best state in the country for sequestering CO2 on a small scale, and therefore our application for this money is going to be very well received. Now, another thing that came up on the ground in Kingman, I did not dream this up in Denmark, is that, well, you know, once you have this possibility for CO2 sequestration, you have the possibility to make sustainable ammonia. Normally, ammonia is made from natural gas. Okay, you have to burn a lot of natural gas to make heat. Never mind that part. But you also use the natural gas as a chemical reactant in the Haber-Bosch process, well-known industry standard process. The output from that chemical process is CO2 with a little bit of water vapor. Water vapor is easy to get rid of. So you have a stream of CO2 from a sustainable ammonia plant analogous to the stream from a biomethane plant that we can pressurize and stick in the ground in any one of those 7,000 enhanced oil recovery wells. And I want to emphasize how incredibly important it is that the EPA has nothing to say about this. This is completely within the jurisdiction of the Kansas Corporation Commission. That's a big deal because EPA only issues Class 6 permits for CO2 sequestration after you've spent millions of dollars and put up a big bond. We don't have to do that. This is all here within the legal power of Kansas to do this. So the idea of a sustainable ammonia plant is exactly this. These same kinds of improvement districts like we have in Kingman, Sustainable Agriculture District, can also use a bond to finance a little tiny ammonia plant. We're talking tiny. We're talking enough to make for 400 farmers, 500 farmers. Anybody in the ammonia industry would tell you this is insane. There's huge economies of scale with an ammonia plant. Nobody would ever build a tiny ammonia plant. That's true if your business is selling ammonia. If your business is making ammonia that's sustainable to cut your own costs, it makes perfect sense. And therefore, the same rural improvement mechanism can be used under the law for districts like the district in Kingman, District 1, to build a little tiny ammonia plant where we stick the CO2 in the ground, all under the authority of Kansas with no EPA involvement whatsoever. So that concludes my main presentation. I have a video clip of a biomethane plant in Denmark that runs on grass silage and manure, which is exactly what I'm about to do in Kingman. And if you'd like, you could see it. It lasts 4 minutes and 40 seconds. I think it's informative. It helps you see what the technology is.
Sure, that sounds good. I think considering the time,
Yeah.
you ought to give the opponents a chance to speak, and then you can go back and show your film.
Okay, I think you might be interested to see it, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, we want to see it too.
Okay.
Okay. So at this point, I'll call on Randy Stuckey. Oh,
Yeah, do you want me to answer questions?
you got a question, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two. One, this doesn't use any fresh water.
Well, in our case, we have a deal with the Kingman City Commission to use their wastewater effluent.
No fresh water.
Not in the case of this particular plant. However, we're talking about 43 plants elsewhere in Kansas. I couldn't promise you that it wouldn't use any water, but it wouldn't use any more than one irrigation well, I don't think.
So then, if I may, one more. You're injecting the salt water back into the ground in order to, that's fracturing, kind of?
Well, okay, fracturing is one version of that, but these enhanced oil recovery wells are mostly simply running, 1,000 barrels a day of pressurized salt water back into the oil field. None of these wells that you see here is a fracking well, to my knowledge. I don't think anybody's doing fracking in Kansas. I don't think.
So
maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know.
pressuring that you're putting in is less than what they're putting in to extract oil off
Yes.
the things. And
Oh yeah.
So what's the difference in the pressure? I mean, what's the PSI of yours versus theirs?
Well, the people who we're working with in Kingman have asked KCC for permission to run 1,000 PSI, although a lot of those wells are running 400, and we could work with 400, 500, 400. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions at this point? Seeing none. Randy, why don't you go ahead and give us your testimony?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Randy Stuckey on behalf of this morning Renew Kansas Biofuels Association and Kansas Grain and Feed Association. We certainly appreciate the previous conferee's testimony on the X's and O's of the science behind what we're talking about this morning. Clearly, what the bill intends to do is draw down some of the, what was announced yesterday by the US EPA is up to $27 billion, specifically $7 billion of that to be set aside for these types of projects. So what the bill, is, as I understand it, intends to do is set up, I don't think it's, as I read the bill, not even new FTEs necessarily inside the KDA, the Kansas Department of Agriculture. It's just identifying, designating some staff members who would set up this program that would assist producers or members such as mine in the state of Kansas to apply for some of this $7 billion that was set aside and through this last summer was the Inflation Reduction Act. $27 billion in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that will be going out to some people or residents of other states if we don't apply for it ourselves. We have, as was just discussed, we have projects in the state of Kansas that are ongoing today that have pursuing these methane projects. They've been doing this for a couple of years now. Certainly that we have the assets to pursue even more of these projects in the state of Kansas. There's a lot of upfront investment and capital expenditure on some of these projects to move forward. This $7 billion, it's a leverage of that federal money with the state private funds, private, not state public monies, to encourage investment, further investment in these projects. So as it would help my member companies and further investment, as was just discussed, I think it's only the right thing to do to try and leverage some of this federal dollars. And I think for a small investment, if any, to the State Department of Agriculture to help us apply for those funds, it makes a lot of sense. So with that, we'd certainly support the bill as it's been introduced, but also what we discussed with a couple of the members on the committee. If you'll draw your attention to Section 1 of the bill, Section 1A1, under the definition of renewable natural gas plant. Right now it says that it means a facility that converts agricultural commodities to methane. That's kind of a narrow, probably too narrow of a definition. In our facilities, you'll see it's not ag commodities necessarily as you would think of them normally, but generally it's agricultural waste and agricultural byproducts that are used in this methane process. So we would just encourage the expansion of that definition to include agricultural waste and agricultural byproducts. Mr. Chairman, that's pretty much my testimony. We'd certainly appreciate the committee moving forward on the bill and amending this small portion and then passing out favorably as amended. Stand for any questions at the appropriate time.
Okay, does anybody have any initial questions for Randy? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I turn your attention to a written-only proponent testimony from Bernard Sheriff, Chairman of the American Biogas Council. So we'll move into the opponents, and Tom Bueller from via WebEx from the Kansas Rural Center. Can you hear us, Tom?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you. You're good. So welcome to the committee.
Great. Thank you so much, Chairman Kirchen. I appreciate the time. I appreciate being able to join you via WebEx as I wasn't able to make it there to the Capitol today. So at the Kansas Rural Center, we've been working on sustainable agriculture for over 40 years here in Kansas. And I will say, I think our issues with this bill is really simply that a couple of the focus points, as I understand them, are a little bit narrowly worded. So I think we're very supportive of creation of a division of sustainable agriculture at the Kansas Department of Agriculture. But we'd like to see the purview of that division opened up to cover more practices. Not just these biofuels plants, but also, supporting producers working on cover cropping, diverse cropping systems, regional local food systems, a broad variety of things that are typically sort of what we call under the realm of sustainable agriculture. So, the Rural Center would be very supportive of that if the bill was amended to kind of open up what is the purpose of that division at the Department of Agriculture. And likewise, we feel like that represents an additional opportunity if the bill isn't sort of limited exclusively to that greenhouse gas reduction fund. There's a variety of other federal funds out there, some through annual farm bill programming and some through the Inflation Reduction Act and other sort of one-time opportunities to provide support for farmers who want to implement, sustainable practices on their farm. With that brief comment, I'd stand for any questions at the appropriate time.
Okay, let's take a few questions. Anybody have any questions for Tom? Seeing none, Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much. You were requesting amendment to this particular bill. Do you have amendment that you would have written up that you'd like to see?
I don't have that. I'm not sure. I guess I'm not a reviser, so some of the wording is challenging for me. But I think the issue that I see, one is there is the word in, let's see, section 1 B sub, let's see which word, sub 2, where it's like the express purpose of this division. If there was some way to open that up that would allow the division to have a broader purpose of encouraging sustainable agriculture practices beyond just the two that are kind of specifically listed there. So I don't know how to word that, but I could work on that.
Thank you.
Okay. Next committee, we have two members on the neutral testimony. So with that, we'll move into the neutrals. We have Justin Cobb in the Nature Conservancy of Kansas. Is he here? There you go.
Sir.
Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to provide neutral testimony on Senate Bill 71. Name is Justin Cobb, represent the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is a nonpartisan conservation nonprofit that has conserved over 150,000 acres of land and water in Kansas. And we are fundamentally practitioners and promoters of sustainable agriculture. I won't try to be too repetitive off of what the Kansas Rural Center provided, but to us, we look at the fundamental definition of sustainable agriculture. We're talking about healthy soils and water conservation. Those simple practices that benefit almost all producers, that increase drought resiliency, decrease inputs, and either stabilize or increase your yields. To us, that's where the conversation around sustainable agriculture has to start. It has a statutory definition in the federal law that supports that. And not to say that the other things we talked about that Dr. Casada mentioned definitely fit underneath the umbrella, but for a starting point for Kansas, we think it's important to remember those basic practices that help the most producers. And so off of that definition, I'm speaking to the administration that this bill would propose, and there are a couple things that we think could be addressed better. Standing up a new division is no insignificant task. And if we look at that definition I just gave for what sustainable agriculture is, we may not need to reinvent the wheel. We have within KDA the Division of Conservation that primarily works in water conservation and in soil health. Now that division has been pretty limited by both its mandate and its funding to those items, but in KDA's recent budget request, they actually asked for an enhancement to go after that IIJA money to be able to provide that to producers. So I think there is infrastructure that it would be needed to pursue this, that the current bill as worded would definitely incur costs in the state. And I think that there are ways that we could work within the Division of Conservation with its established grassroots structure through the 105 conservation districts to be able to make this a little less of a fiscal note for the practical side. And then the other thing that I think Kansas Rural Center really touched on was the specificity of this bill is pretty concerning. So right off the bat, the Greenhouse Gas Fund is not a guarantee. The $7 billion is competitive. For most of that fund, the larger pot, there are environmental justice criteria attached to it that our projects, may run afoul of, that we may not be available for. So if we do open that up and we allow to go for other funds, we allow for KDA to have flexibility when working with or establishing nonprofits, because that's a hard timeline. If we're going from scratch to September 30th, 2024, you've got to put in an application, and who knows when the request for application will be due. We likely may spend $175,000, as the fiscal note indicates, and not get anything out of it. But if we allow for some leniency, how they can pursue that money, and also, if they don't get that funds, they can perhaps look at other funds that would also benefit similar projects. So I think our overwhelming suggestion is that we take a step back, incorporate a bigger picture that would benefit all producers, while still encompassing the projects that are the priority of Senate Bill 71. And we have some draft language that would speak to that effect. It's something we'd certainly like to collaborate more with stakeholders like KDA and yourselves to develop, but that would be our suggestion. I'd be happy to take any questions.
You can turn that in, that information.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Suggestions also. Any questions for Justin? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for coming. And this is sort of just an initial draft, I think an important draft. Would you be comfortable with wording that said such division of sustainable agriculture should have an initial purpose so that it's very clear that if we don't come up with the wording in the next few days, we still have an opportunity to expand on this division?
I absolutely agree, Senator Francisco. The language that you have was my first draft. I've already gotten some feedback from Kelsey that I need to make some revisions so it better work, but I think that something along that concept would definitely be better for the state.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions? Okay, thank you, Justin. Next, we'll have Kelsey Olson, Kansas Department of Agriculture. Kelsey, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Senator Fagg and members of this committee. My name is Kelsey Olson, and I serve as the Deputy Secretary of the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Many of the things that have been shared this morning, I'm going to simply reiterate from the agency's perspective. But Senate Bill 71 charges the department with doing two things. The first being to create the Division of Sustainable Agriculture within KDA, and doing so on or before June 1st of 2023. The second element is to charge KDA with creating a non-for-profit organization called the Kansas Sustainable Ag Fund. And while a state agency certainly can create a non-for-profit, I am concerned about the timeline in which that we would need to establish that nonprofit organization. And in order to go after these specific funds that are outlined for the greenhouse gas reduction funds. In addition to that, as it was pointed out, this does charge the counties with creating sustainable ag districts. While I do understand that there is one in our state, there is no guarantee that there will be additional districts created, and therefore the agency potentially could be left with an entity that is kind of a shell and has very limited elements of being able to utilize and move funds out accordingly. As the last conferee pointed out, KDA does generally support sustainable agriculture practices, and we believe that there are many elements that we are currently doing that could and are considered sustainable agriculture, whether that's within the Division of Conservation or including within our ag marketing team as we promote local foods and access to more sustainable ag products for the consumer. Additionally, just wanted to mention that this bill specifically is very limited in its language and supports the construction and the commission of the renewable gas plants and sustainable ammonia. Currently, KDA does not regulate these entities, and we do not have any expertise as it pertains to this area. And I wonder whether or not KDA would be the right entity for administering greenhouse gas emission funds potentially. All that to say, we could do these things that we're charged with, and if that's the will of the legislature, we will do our best. But I do think that this bill is slightly limiting, and there's not necessarily any guarantee that these grants would become available or that we would create a division and then maybe not have anything to do with the division if there weren't additional funds. Lastly, I'm just pointing out that those improvement districts, those are all triggered at the county level and are outside the agency's control. I just think that overall, this creates a little bit of uncertainty as to what the agency, we could do these items, but then whether or not there's funding that would come forth may or may not be the best use of the agency's time and existing resources. So with that, I would just ask you consider these items that I've outlined, and happy to stand for any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Committee, we got any questions?
Thank you, fellow committee member. I appreciate your comments. So kind of two questions. Based on your knowledge of other agencies, would the Kansas Department of Health and Environment or the Conservation District be a better fit than the Department of Ag?
I think that there could be other entities such as the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. I'm not an expertise when it talks about what the KCC does as opposed to KDHE. And so I don't, at first glance, one of those might be a better entity, but I don't want to speak out of turn.
I appreciate your mentioning the Kansas Corporation Commission. So this is a sizable opportunity for an agricultural state. So if we don't do it in this way, do you have any other ideas about how we could meet what is a very aggressive timeline from the federal government?
So from my understanding of the greenhouse gas funds that are available, there's two channels that it somewhat outlines. One is to provide funds to state government entities and tribal units, and there's another then that's specifically for nonprofit organizations. So without more guidance from the feds at this point in time, I believe that there would still be the ability for a state agency, whether that's KDA or someone else, to still try to procure some of those additional federal funding. It's not specified that we necessarily need a division of sustainable agriculture or that a state entity needs to have a nonprofit organization to channel those funds through.
If I may, so the Department of Agriculture could take these funds and then provide a way to issue grants to private industry.
Absolutely. And we know that there's certainly interest out there, whether it's methane digesters that some of our pork industry might be interested in, or dairies. There are elements within the individuals in the ag stakeholder community that I think some of these funds could be applied to, but we need to know more information about what the federal government will be targeting and what they're looking for.
I do understand that the federal government has not given very much guidance to date, but we have also a calendar in the legislature that we're trying to meet. Thank you.
Senator Pack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a small government conservative, I'm looking at this. I do have a question for you, and I do appreciate your testimony. I appreciate the testimony of the other neutral and the opponent. It looks like to me the federal government is taking $7 billion of taxpayer money, thereby increasing the federal deficit, to incentivize states to move toward their agenda of renewable away from petroleum. And they put a really narrow window on this. Your testimony from the Department of Agriculture, our fiscal note, has a lot of good information that I trust the committee will take a look at, because there are so many uncertainties in this $7 billion incentive. But my question to you is, if the legislature did decide for some reason to move forward with Senate Bill 71, however, we remove the establish or create new government positions, could the Department of Agriculture, with existing personnel, administer this program, understanding that there may never be any benefit come to Kansas, and it may cost us $173,000.
So currently, within the Kansas Department of Agriculture, we do not have staff that have the additional capabilities to go to help procure grant and federal funding opportunities. As part of our budget enhancement, we had actually addressed the need for a position because there are many federal funds that are becoming available, and we don't feel like we have the capacity to currently go after those funds in a thorough manner. I can write a grant in a day, but that might not actually get us the funds, or it might not be the best application. So we believe that there's many funds that could come to the state and through the Department of Ag, but we had identified even early on that that was something that we were lacking when it comes to capabilities within our existing staff. Those two enhancements were not supported by the governor in the governor's budget. So I would just, I'm not advocating for that. I just know that our capabilities are limited.
So if we do create 2 new government worker positions, it sounds like from what you said, they would be somewhat specialized, or it would take a specialized person to be able to apply for, write these grants, and then administer the money. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is that?
No, that's very accurate. We would love to have some, a position or 2 on staff that could, were trained grant writers who had that capability to identify all of the requirements in the request for federal assistance, the RFAs, make sure that all of the reporting, there's a lot of reporting requirements when we procure federal funds, and that takes a lot of time and capacity for staff. So we believe that's a specialized skill set that we would like to retain within the agency.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Mr. Substitute Vice Chairman.
Any other questions? Senator Francisco.
Thank you. Hearing that there are other opportunities that the department might have for a grant writer, would you be able to help us with any wording that would expand the ability of the position in that Department of Ag to look to not just these grants, but other grants? And I would really hope that they do address the issue of sustainable agriculture, which I think you have been embracing.
Yeah, I'd be happy to work with you on some language like that.
Any other questions? I have one for you. When they decide on 2, why not 4, why not 1? I kind of like the 1 staying within the program, because I would imagine there's other grants that would be out there that person could work with. Why did they set on 2?
So when we worked on that fiscal note, we thought long and hard about what goes into those grants. So there is certainly a skill that takes to write the grant, and then there's a skill set that's slightly different to administer the grant and manage that grant. Depending on the full, what the requirements might be for the grant, that can be a full-time job. But we have some food and drug administrative grants in our food and safety program. There's one person who, that's their entire responsibility, checking with fiscal to make sure the right elements are in place, making sure that they're completing the reports to the federal government, which can be every 2 months or every 6 months. Each grant might be different, and so depending on what those requirements might be for the grant that we are trying to procure, we feel that that would take somebody to probably manage that. Now, as time goes on, we might be able to procure more grants without adding additional people, depending on what that level of work would require. But that would just depend on what grants that we're talking about.
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go with that. In your opinion, if one of these went into western Kansas, would it be freshwater neutral?
I don't know the science and the technology well enough to say that. My opinion, when I look at this, I raise concerns in my mind about what that water load looks like, because we know that water is a precious natural resource that we are currently talking quite a bit about. And then also, when it comes to the forage input, we use a lot of forage in the state of Kansas for our feedlots, as well as for our dairy industry. And so my personal gut reaction is, one, what kind of water is it take? And two, will this drive up our forage costs for our other ag industry?
I think we have to be careful in western Kansas. You know, use gray water or whatever's cool, that's fine. But fresh water, I've got to be real careful. Thank you, Mr.
Okay, is there any other questions? Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions the committee would like to ask any of the people who's been here at this point? Sure.
I have 3 points. The first is that the EPA just yesterday issued the guidance on the greenhouse gas reduction fund that just came out. The second is concerning the environmental justice aspect of some of the greenhouse gas reduction fund availability. There are 14 counties in Kansas that qualify for those criteria, including our target number 2 and number 3 for districts, Harper and Ness. And the last point I want to say is I am a professional writer of very boring documents, patents, and I'll be happy to write this grant for you.
Robert, I might ask you a quick question if I could too.
Yeah.
From your perspective and being from Denmark, when you look around the world with China, Russia, South America, Africa, are they doing things in this area, or are we the only ones doing this?
Well, I'm actually from Kansas, but I mean, I'm a sixth-generation Kansas. But yes, Russia certainly is not doing this kind of thing, but China is. China definitely is. China has a very aggressive policy to clean up their act because they realize that their act is not clean, and they are working on it. Russia doesn't care. That's my impression.
About South America and Africa here?
Well, in South America, there is, I think, some of this because of ethanol. There's a lot of cellulosic ethanol being done in South America. They have cars that just run on pure ethanol. So there is some of this activity in South America. What was it? What was the other?
Africa.
I don't know. I think probably not much happening in Africa.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Okay, if not, we'll close this hearing, and thank you all for coming. We are adjourned.